Well, the symptoms of autism are unique and really were not seen before the 1930s when this kind of ethylmercury compound was first used. So in a sense, it's a novel form of mercury poisoning. That's the title of the first study that suggested this idea. In other cases, though, you can see similar things like central nervous system damage and gastrointestinal issues, which various kinds of mercury can cause. Mercury is a strange and horrible compound that can cause different symptoms in different children. It can be delayed for months or even years. And depending on the species of mercury, you see different effects. But clearly, the kind of thing that we see in full-blown autism could certainly be explained by mercury poisoning. If a child, I think, gets a dose of mercury like the kind that are now used in flu vaccines, and they have a susceptibility to autism if they can't excrete the mercury or they have an underlying medical problem or a mitochondrial disorder, it's an invitation to a lifetime of disability, and so it absolutely must not let that happen. Well, in our book, The Age of Autism, we've traced the rise of the autism epidemic to the first uses of a very toxic mercury compound called ethylmercury, which was first commercialized in the 1930s and was used as a preservative for vaccines and as a lumber fungicide and as a seed disinfectant. And the first 11 cases that were reported in the medical literature in 1943 by a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins named Leo Connor, we found 7 of those families, we've identified those kids, and we see what we think is a strong link to those compounds. So we feel very clear that mercury was the trigger for the rise of autism. Now, since then, the amount of mercury in vaccines was tremendously increased starting in the early 1990s when autism also exploded. We don't think that's a coincidence either. We're not saying that every single case of autism was caused by mercury or vaccines, but we think it's a major clue. We think it shows that autism is in fact a man-made epidemic, and that if we understand that, we can stop it. The idea that autism has always been around, that it's genetic, that there's not much you can do about it, and that there's no particular environmental factor causing it, we just don't think that adds up. We think the evidence is much stronger that humans have caused it, and in many cases the medical profession itself, through what may be excessive zeal to stamp out every possible infectious disease in the world. Some of them are not really worth the effort, like chickenpox. They may have introduced too much immune stimulation, too many toxins, including mercury, and triggered a whole new era of chronic illnesses in kids, autism being the most notable, but also possibly including asthma, ADD, ADHD, and a number of other problems that we really need to get a grip on. Mercury is a bad toxin. And I think that the medical industry has still not come to terms with how bad it is. They say that the amount that's now used in flu shots, which are recommended for all pregnant women and for babies over 6 months of age, is just not enough to do harm. And that it could not be further from the truth. The amount of mercury that can damage a fetus or a developing infant and irreparably harm the immune system and the brain is nanomolar level, which is parts per billion and possibly even parts per trillion. Just many times more toxic than the mercury you would find in a thermometer. And people don't understand there's really no comparison, and that you cannot put this kind of mercury in anything that comes into contact with human beings, let alone infants and pregnant women, and be surprised when damage occurs. I would say it's many times more toxic than lead. There's no doubt about it. It's the second most toxic element on Earth after plutonium.
For people that don't know what denial is about, what is denial about?
Yeah. Well, before I say that, Dill, I want to give a shout out to my co-author, Dan Olmsted, who also did a lot of that research. We did that together, and Dan passed away unexpectedly a week after we finished, so that I'm representing Dan too. Denial is about this really pernicious thing that's starting to happen, which is the politically correct orthodox view of autism is that, the numbers are going up, but that's not something to be concerned about because really autism has always been with us. Or maybe it's going up, but it doesn't really matter if it's going up. All that matters is just taking care of the kids. And, you know, as happy talk that is easier to deal with in a policy standpoint because it's not a call for action, but as a view of reality, it's really dangerous because we are faced in this country for sure with a very, very sharp increase in the rates of autism. We've never had adults with autism. Now we're starting to have young adults hit the services system. We're straining the school systems. Parents and families are under pressure. And if we don't, as a society, come to grips with the fact that we've got a really serious problem, we're in big trouble. Denial,
then, really is the denial that there's an autism epidemic.
That's right.
So denial is essentially saying there are people now saying that there is no epidemic.
Right. That
autism's always been here.
And we're just doing better diagnosis.
Right.
So that's the argument. Before 1930, our parents' childhoods, before 1930, the rate of autism in the world was effectively zero. Doesn't mean there weren't scattered cases. That doesn't mean we can't go back and find someone that might fit the description. But in terms of the overall rate, it's basically effectively zero.
Right.
And then among children born in the 1930s, in two places, in Austria, in Vienna, and in the U.S., two people separated, didn't even know each other, Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger, found and described a new phenomenon among children born in the 1930s. And then the literature continues to describe these kinds of kids for a long time, but the rates were low. You mentioned 1 in 10,000, which was the U.S. rate when people looked at it. The first paper in 1943 was published. He described, and his case one was a young man from Mississippi, a young child who was born in 1933.
Okay.
His parents took him up to Johns Hopkins to visit with him in 1938. So Leo Kanner first saw his first case of autism in 1938, and then he started looking around, and they assembled 11 cases, some of them in Maryland, some of them from around the country, and they all were remarkably just like this first case. And so Kanner said, wow, this is interesting. I've never seen anything like this before. And he wrote this paper to say there's this thing, early infantile autism. A characteristic of the disability is rigidity and inflexibility of thought. And so you often confront that when you're interacting with affected young adults who are higher functioning. But you also, there's a reality of the disorder, which is it comes with a medical issues, gastrointestinal problems, pain, dietary issues. And one of the things we do hear from a segment of the adult autistic community is that, you know, the neurodiversity argument is harmful to them because the denial that autism is new, environmentally caused, and comes with comorbid medical conditions gets in the way of people taking them seriously. And so, you know, it's a multifaceted, nuanced topic, but the notion that a parent who says, you know, we want to stop the injury is against the community of children, including the community of injured children, that's not right. In fact, we're probably their best friends. We looked for, you know, if autism existed before Kanner labeled it the way he did and Asperger labeled it the way he did, and they used that same word, if it existed previously, you ought to be able to find it because people were writing about mentally disturbed children before those guys.
Right.
So let's look for it. What other label could it have carried? And there were two we started with that were the most well-known mental disorders of childhood. One was childhood schizophrenia, and schizophrenia was described in the 19th century, and so you had mentally ill, insane people, that was the word that was used, as adults before Kanner and Asperger, and so were there cases of children who were insane. And so that's one category. And then there was this other group that was called, it was discovered by a guy named Theodore Heller and he labeled the disorder dementia infantilis, which is dementia meaning a regression, a loss of symptoms in infants. And so we looked at the literature on those two, and that was sort of where we started. And so the thing about schizophrenia is that it was widely prevalent. There were unusual symptoms, some of which might bear a resemblance to autistic symptoms. The word autism was used first in the context of describing schizophrenic symptoms. And so, but most of the time with schizophrenia, you have a normal period of development, and then there's a period where you go insane, and there is a descent, and it's usually in adolescence or after. And so, but there were people that wrote about early onset schizophrenia, who wrote about children who were in insane asylums. And so we looked at that literature. And what you find is, in a nutshell, you can't find autism, but there's like a debate. Does childhood schizophrenia even exist? Is there such a thing as someone who regresses in childhood? And so, and it's not just in childhood. Most of the time it's adolescence. Autism, by definition, has to occur before 3 years of age.
Right.
And so age of onset was really important to distinguish autism from childhood schizophrenia, which, as it's been described, even if it exists, is something different. In the first book ever written about a collection of cases in an insane asylum, both cases were developed normally as children and had a vaccine injury and then went insane.
Interesting, right.
So vaccine injury has been present and observed since the beginning of insanity.
As we've learned and embraced the reality of the fraud that William Thompson is the witness for, it's really important for us to remember that that fraud is not just a single isolated instance, but it's part of a pattern of behavior and corruption that really comes from the leading institutions of medicine, including the Centers for Disease Control, including the British Medical Association. And the story is not just about Thompson and that one study. It's also a story about Andy Wakefield and what's happened to him, but it's also, but most importantly, it's a story about a cover-up of injuries to children, especially as they relate to vaccines and autism. The Thompson story is not new. It's a new episode, and it's told more effectively than it's ever been told before, and there are dramatic audio tapes of what Thompson's confessions are, but there are other confessions, there is other evidence, there is other, there have been other instances of fraud. Brian Deere, Frank DiStefano, Thomas Verstraeten, all of these people, Marshall and Jurgen Allstock, Colleen Boyle, there's been a pattern of corruption at the CDC for at least 2 decades. These people should go to jail. And it's important to understand, it's important to hear the words. You hear Thompson's words, but clearly it's not only thimerosal, it's not only MMR, it's not only vaccines, but the totality of the change in the program are things that we all need to embrace, and everything that's statistically significant and elevated is an important risk factor for our children. And everybody who has stood up for us, whether it's Brian Hooker or Andy Wakefield or Del Bigtree or Polly Tommy or Lynn Redwood or Sally Bernard, we need to get behind all of those people. We all need to come together. We need to hold this corrupt institution accountable and stop the autism epidemic in its tracks. Thanks very much.